There is a desert, in the desert between California and Arizona, right on the border, there is a fabricated town called Felicity that its architects identify as the center of the world. You may have seen this written up in the New York Times a couple months ago. It has two residents, Jacques-André Estelle and Felicia Lee Estelle, and a quantity of newly built pyramids and granite slabs on which the Estelles are in the process of having carved the history of the world as they wish to tell it. They are, in their odd way, correct, of course. Felicity is the center of the world for the Estelles, the place they mind bodily stand, and the history of the world that they are inscribing on their granite slabs. I mean, it's huge. On their granite slabs is the history of the world that they, in their odd adventure and admittedly absurdist joke, both retrotend and protend. In the isolation of the desert, they can pretty much invent time and place to their own specifications. Poteat's lesson, taught hundreds of times over, was that every I establishes the center of the world. That is to say, the mind body that owns itself, when I say I, establishes the whence from which I live, the here, the anchoring this, the stable now, from which and to which I orient my apprehension of the vast array of otherness and the sequence of change. It is the platform from which I launch all my projects. As he says in the essay, I Will Die, for myself, I am not in the world as Jones is in the world. When I use I of myself, something is being named which is, for me, not just the spatio-temporal speaker or behavior from whom the noise I has come. If you ask me what it is that is named, hoping to have an answer given in reports of behavior alone, then of course I can't say. You are asking a question that on your terms, as I have been trying to show, it is impossible to answer. If you do not ask what it is that is named in your Cartesian critical terms, then my answer is quite simply, myself. Only by a feat of considerable abstraction do I come to imagine myself as one instance, one entity that occupies a place in a landscape alongside many unprepossessing, Poteat's word, others, none occupying a privileged or orienting point of view. So my purpose here is to start a thread of conversation about Poteat's contribution to the philosophy of the self, or the philosophy of the subject, offering some remarks on three 20th century figures who also made contributions to our thinking about selves and subjects, and with whose work Poteat was familiar: Hannah Arendt, Gabriel Marcel, and H. Richard Niebuhr. I have chosen these three because they happen to be among my current interests, so hence it's very important that at the end of this you talk about your interests. I do recognize that it would probably have been more responsible to choose Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Martin Heidegger, and Paul Ricoeur as conversation partners on this subject, since those three authors all made it into the recent benchmark collection, Self and Subjectivity, that has been brought out by Blackwell. The editor of that volume notes, quote, despite the various challenges to the philosophy of the subject posed by reductionist neuroscience and postmodern critique, the essays in this collection attest to the continuing relevance of concepts of self and subjectivity. So in light of our conversation about Poteat not fitting into philosophy late yesterday afternoon, I'm wondering if we're looking at the right philosophy. Because it does seem to me he fits very nicely into this collection of considerations. Now, first, a digression. This business about critics of modernity is really troubling to me. Oliver O'Donovan, in Ways of Judgment, described modernity this way. I just love this. That great carcass around which a shoal of sharp-toothed narratives forever wheels and hovers. Modernity. Certainly this term, critics of modernity, comes straight out of Poteat, and I just love that notion of amiable lunatics that got introduced into the discussion yesterday. But I'm troubled by characterizing Poteat as a critic of modernity and characterizing his company of fellow travelers as critics of modernity for three reasons. First of all, I think that it frames the project as a critique of modern culture in deconstructive, negative, critical terms rather than constructive terms. And that all this fascination with the sickness, lunacy, bankruptcy, disease of modern culture tends to lure one into the fly bottle from which one wishes to help others escape. And when I'm reading Poteat, I'm always glad when he said, well, where I want to take my stand. And I would say, well, could we just get all the other stuff out of the way, and could you just take your stand and do it? So that's the first objection, is it's like socking the tar baby, which I know is not politically correct as a metaphor anymore, but you get stuck to it. And you can't unstick yourself. My second concern about framing this as critics of modernity is that modernity or modern culture, and this is just Yeager being allergic to grand narratives, all right? But it's such a broad term as to be almost meaningless. So do we find mind-body dualism problematic? Do we want to highlight the ill effects of excessive skepticism in epistemology or human affairs? Do we want to explore the effects on philosophical argument of something that might properly be called, as Poteat calls it, the Enlightenment's theater of solitude? Do we worry about depersonalization? Well, fine. Let's take on those problems as problems. You can take on any and all of those problems as problems without invoking this vast carcass. My third objection is that from one angle of analysis, Poteat is actually himself representative of modernity. Thank God. His focus on language and self-consciousness is itself thoroughly modern, if the notion of modern has any meaning at all. In a conversation with Paul Ricoeur, Gabriel Marcel made the point that Descartes' work forms a turning point because solely of his primary affirmation, I am. And once we look at Descartes in that way, Poteat is more his obstreperous heir than his enemy. And my worry, frankly, is that it may be precisely the passing of modernity that will make Poteat's vision and his contribution worthless, along with all the other forms of personalism, for want of a better word, that have animated our inquiry for 4 centuries in the West. I have a colleague, a historian, who repeatedly says, and I'm quoting, modernity is over. Even the postmodern died on 9/11. The only question is, what comes next? And this won't, she says, be something shaped by those of us in the universities. Our job is to try to pay enough attention to notice what is happening. And such noticing, such paying attention is wildly different from hacking lumps of fat and gristle off the great carcass. My colleague, for example, is teaching transhumanism, H+, and structures her noticing around GRIN technologies, genetics, robotics, information systems, and nanotech, what one commentator, I think, appropriately calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. There's a lot to notice. Drones, robots rolling down the hospital hallway, proposals to turn over to artificial intelligence battlefield decisions about which targets to hit and which military actions do and do not accord with the Geneva Conventions, vast accumulations of data and unprecedented levels of surveillance, the machining of industry toward human redundancy, uncontrollable cascades of computerized exchanges in the global financial sector, corporatization and standardization of interpersonal activities, including education on an industrial scale, rationalization and routinization of human exchanges, homogenization of context, desires, and points of view, paramilitary arsenals stockpiled in the apartment next door, virtualization of contact, communication, and real life. In the face of changes on this scale, it might well seem that the great carcass of modernity is already pretty much well rotted away, leaving only the shoals of hovering critics to mark the place it once lay. So Poteat seems more and more to me as sort of the finest flower of modernity, and not really its critic. But to turn to Hannah Arendt, I want to focus here on her question, the question she says the world puts to every newcomer: who are you? I have accented the space of appearances in my title because it captures for me something essential about Poteat's graduate classes, and less dramatically, his undergraduate classes as well. I was his teaching assistant in a couple undergraduate classes that looked at Hannah Arendt's human condition. According to Arendt, in the widest sense, the space of appearances is, and I'm quoting here, the space where I appear to others as others appear to me, where men exist not merely like other living or inanimate things, but make their appearance as persons explicitly. Appearing, then, is accomplished by speech and action. It is a matter of self-disclosure, and the agonal spirit is the passionate, and this is a quote, the passionate drive to show oneself in measuring up against others. And I don't think we should omit to notice how much a feature of Poteat's being in the world that was. The passionate drive to show oneself in measuring up against others. The space of appearances, closely aligned to the public realm, is a forum, common to all, in which, by speech and action, all may emerge from the anonymous mass, and some may come to prominence or glory. It is also, much more importantly, I think, the space in which what we value is, as she puts it, saved from the destruction of time. And this is a paragraph that I want to read just because it's so crucial. The reality of the public realm relies on the simultaneous presence of innumerable perspectives and aspects in which the common world presents itself, and for which no common measurement or denominator can ever be devised. For though the common world is the common meeting ground of all, those who are present have different locations in it, and the location of one can no more coincide with the location of another than the location of two objects. Being seen and being heard by others derive their significance from the fact that everybody sees and hears from a different position. This is the meaning of public life, compared to which even the richest and most satisfying family life can offer only the prolongation and multiplication of one's own position with its attending aspects and perspectives. The subjectivity of privacy can be prolonged and multiplied in a family. It can even become so strong that its weight is felt in the public realm. This is her notion of the degeneration of the public realm into society, which is the private writ large. But this family world can never replace the reality rising out of the sum total of aspects presented by one object to a multitude of spectators. Only where things can be seen by many in a variety of aspects without changing their identity, so that those who are gathered around them know they see sameness in utter diversity, only in that situation can worldly reality truly and reliably appear. The space of appearances corresponds, as this passage makes vividly clear, to the human condition of plurality, where plurality is conceived so radically as to throw into doubt the conception of a common human nature. which she actually explicitly denies that there is any such thing. Under conditions of plurality, appearance is not the contrary of the real. Appearance, something that is being seen and heard by others as well as by ourselves, constitutes reality. The sharing and multiplying of the same perspective in mass society represents the destruction of the common world of the agora. In the absence of a genuine space of appearances, we are all, she says, imprisoned in the subjectivity of our own singular experience. Thus, for Poteat, Arendt provided a kind of shield against privatization, philosophical idealism, relativism, and subjectivism that are all the occupational hazards of the philosophies of the self. But in terms of Poteat's own account of personal identity and the nature of the subject, Arendt's distinction between the who and the what of any given individual was also important. Any human being is an observable, describable what? A continuing physical thing, mobile and developmental, but traceable and relatively stable. In addition to physical characteristics, it includes the constellation of the individual's gifts, qualities, talents, and shortcomings. While the what of Yeager is available to the observer without any action on my part, who I am can be disclosed only in action, setting in motion new beginnings and speech. By such action and speech, I reveal my unique personal identity. Curiously and paradoxically, Arendt argues that the who appears so clearly and unmistakably to you, remains hidden from me. Only someone else can tell the story of the unique, unchangeable identity that has been revealed by what? This mind-body acting. And that essence cannot be known or fully told until the person's full life arc has been completed. Still, throughout our lives, we carry our essential identity with us, according to Arendt, like a Greek diamond. Who I am stands behind the arc of my action, looking at you over my shoulder, so to speak, and thus hidden from the person herself, from me. It nevertheless appears clearly and unmistakably to others, according to Arendt. Arendt's image of the diamond coordinates well, I think, with Poteat's own distinction between the systematically elusive, active, speaking, sense-making I and the substantive self that the agent can describe. I can describe to you who Diane Yeager is, and that the agent, to some considerable extent, simply invents. Oddly, out of those classes, I didn't have a graduate class, I don't think, in which Poteat did the human condition, so I'm only speaking in terms of the undergraduate classes I observed. Oddly, I do not remember Poteat exploring in great depth what Arendt was doing with action. He concentrated mainly on her remarks on the importance of speech. Now, if my memory on this is at all accurate, this indifference is probably quite significant. In critical engagement with our abstractly speculative European philosophical heritage, one path has gone, in critical, obstreperous engagement, one path has gone by way of the recovery or rehabilitation of the body. And it is interesting to me that Poteat, though he insisted he was a feminist, paid zero attention to feminist writing on the body. One path has gone by way of recovery or rehabilitation of the body, and that's the path that Poteat, I think, increasingly took. I think that becomes a stronger and stronger motif as he goes along. The other critical path, though, goes by way of elevating action over thought, a maneuver which is intrinsically subversive of any segmentation of agents into body parts and mind parts, and of the privileging and subversive of the privileging of thought and the abstractions of logic. So, for example, Marcel himself says that to deny the metaphysical intelligible whole, or in in the process of doing that. Consideration of action as something other than the content of thought is crucial, right? So we could think of action as the content of thought, and we can sort of condense action into decision, but to address the metaphysical intelligibility of the whole is really to see action as thought as subordinate to action, thought as always following in the track of action, so to speak. So now, the path to the rehabilitation of the body remains, I think, generally individual and lends itself to preoccupation with the immediacy of intuition. This theme is not, of course, absent from Arendt, who has much to say about earthliness as one of the four dimensions of the human condition. But the other path, the elevation of action and the separation of action from thought, the other path is necessarily, it seems to me, more social and more ethical. As Arendt makes so clear, one acts into a social web, an inextricably tangled plurality. Every action has consequences, planned and unplanned, and every action is both imputable and irrevocable. In various texts, I Will Die, for example, Poteat actively resists identifying the I with the accumulation of the agent's acts. He seems to have three reasons for doing this. First, he thinks the term acts is question-begging because it facilitates the slippage of mind by which we elide agents and leave ourselves with a depersonalized world of concrete, unauthorized, and thus accidental objects or events. Mistakes were made, which we hear a lot, in Washington at least. His second objection seems to be that any attempt to represent agency through catalogs and reports of observed acts or behaviors will necessarily be a reductive account of agency. But to say that, I think, is to have already a reductive account of act that compared with Hannah Arendt's understanding of act. The third reason he gives is that relations and bonds between persons, specifically love, friendship, responsibility, forgiveness, and freedom, cannot be fully apprehended or analyzed in terms of behavior in space-time. Poteat's tendency to render action as observable behavior is, I think, a reductive treatment of action and produces an understanding of act that is quite different from that of Arendt. In Recovering the Ground, Poteat, I think, actively misrepresents Arendt, or perhaps more fairly, he paints her work with too broad a brush. On 128 and 130, he reduces action to speech, which she does not do. All right, speech accompanies action, but she does not reduce action to speech. He associates world with work, and that thing, I think, is also a mistake. He therefore concludes that the world into which we come at birth is the residue of work, rather than being, far more importantly, the sedimentation of action over and above the accumulation of artifacts. This leads him to say, wrongly, quote, as Arendt is at pains to show, of all human activity, speech is the most futile. Close quotes. Speech is hardly futile. Our deeds and their consequences, and our speech is among our deeds and their consequences reach in an endless chain to the end of time, according to Arendt, creating almost insuperable problems of anxiety and guilt, for which the power to promise and the power to forgive, themselves verbal, intersubjective transactions, for which the power to promise and the power to forgive are the only available remedies. All right. So I think looking at Arendt and Poteat in relationship discloses a lot of things about Poteat, and looking at how he read Arendt and what he chose not to pursue is, I think, also a very illuminating feature of the comparison. The second thinker I want to look at is Gabriel Marcel, more as a representative of figures who have begun with some intensity in the past 30 years to examine the notion of testimony. So before I get to Marcel, I want to say a few things about testimony. And this is new literature to me, and this is why I didn't have my paper ready to put up on the website. I said to myself when I got into the thick of this, Yeager, why don't you ever pick something you already know something about, instead of always picking something that we have to learn a whole body of literature before you can even get started on the enterprise. The phenomenon of testimony and the related notion of bearing witness has received increasing attention in recent philosophy, and the broad notion of testimony or witness was consistently important to Poteat's accounts of both the nature of personhood and the securing of knowledge claims. In a way, testimony might be said to provide one of the bridge concepts linking his ontological and epistemological concerns. If that goes too far, and you might think that that does, if that goes too far, we can still certainly say that since he never conceived language as essentially propositional, or probably essentially anything, he concerned himself with its performative and practical dimensions. And this literature on testimony is focusing on just that, the performative and practical dimensions of our speaking. Contemporary literature on the subject has emerged as part of a broad resistance to what we might call the deracinate strand in accounts of both knowing and speaking. These rich and interesting explorations of testimony can be gathered into 5 clusters. These approaches bleed into one another, so the groupings would be better visualized as a Venn diagram. And one of the things I was going to copy was this very neat and tidy Venn diagram, which I have put in a very untidy way on the board behind me. The first cluster of concerns in which the notion of testimony finds a role is the philosophical, and this is core philosophy, philosophical interest in testimony as it grows out of epistemological problems of justifying belief in what people say, or verifying belief in what people say. They tell me the sun goes around the earth. It looks to me, the earth goes around the sun. It looks to me like the reverse. Why should I trust those people, their testimony, as opposed to my experience? The model here is testimony in court, and the issue is credibility. And this is probably the biggest body of literature on testimony, the testimony and verification. Under what circumstances are we justified in accepting as true what someone tells us is true, when we ourselves have no first-hand knowledge of the subject? Related to that, but distinctly different, is the consideration of testimony in relation to illocutionary force. This body of literature is much smaller than the first cluster and related to it in that the concern is still epistemological. For 3 reasons, this cluster resonates more with Poteat's own concerns. First, these writers are more skeptical concerning the notion of objective truth than the ones in the first group that take up testimony. Second, these writers approach testimony with the analytical tools of ordinary language analysis, and some of what they write sounds a lot like what I heard Poteat do when he was doing ordinary language analysis in the classroom. And third, they attend explicitly to intersubjectivity. Now, the third cluster is testimony and idiosyncratic experience. The reflective philosopher Gabriel Marcel introduces testimony in the context of the distinction, which anchors so much of his work, between problems and mysteries. Testimony belongs to the second class. So I also had this really nifty chart of Marcel and the distinction between problems and mysteries, and I can send around in a few minutes. Most of what we reference in our speech belongs to the domain of shared natural and social reality, equally open to investigation by all participants, according to Marcel. But sometimes people undertake to speak about personal experiences that are somehow outside that domain of shared investigation, perhaps because they are internal states, tension, fatigue, pain, emotions such as fear, gratitude, or joy, or because they involve access to features of reality that are not open to all investigation by all. Nightmares, religious experiences, substance-induced perceptions, love, friendship, and other commitments. Here, testimony is communication of idiosyncratic experience or knowledge. I'm not even sure what we should call it. We call it testimony because in principle it cannot be checked by others. Not surprisingly, this use of testimony is more common among religiously oriented thinkers than philosophical epistemologists. And then there's the fourth cluster, which is testimony and memory. Disconnected from epistemological concerns almost entirely, the literature on violence, genocide, and other atrocities showcases testimony prominently. We should begin by noticing that all reports of past events fall into the category of interpretation and cannot be verified in the same sense that we might seek to verify reports about present events, arrangements, and permanent realities. So there is a sense in which verbalized memory is always and necessarily testimony. For this reason, any telling of the past, and this includes all political, national, ethnic, and religious traditions, is always selective and is usually subject to revision or argument. In that sense, testimony concerning the past is rather like testimony concerning interior states or unobservable experiences. Yet out of the Holocaust and other similar experiences of trauma and horror, there has emerged a still more specific connotation of testimony and memory. Just by the fact of surviving, the survivors become witnesses, offering mute testimony, sometimes mute, sometimes verbal testimony, to the unshareable and even unspeakable. In this context, particular poignancy is given to the notion of witness or testimony, because with each passing year, with respect to the Holocaust in particular, because with each passing year, fewer remain who can bear witness. That is, fewer remain who were participants in the events, who carry the actual imprint of the events on their bodies and the actual experiences seared into their personal memories. They bear before the community the mark of the past uniquely. Their very existence is a reproach as well as triumph. And the fifth category is testimony or witnessing in practice. This does not actually turn up much in explicit treatments of testimony, but one can find it implicitly worked out in literary and cinematic stories, from the death of Ivan Ilyich to Tender Mercies. In this usage, testimony stands over against language and is used to mark the divergence between the convictions, commitments, and suppositions that people report or formulate propositionally, and the convictions, commitments, and suppositions out of which they actually organize their interactions and their lifeways. So William James famously suggested that if we want to know what people really believe, we should not listen to what they say, but rather observe what they do. The clusters that are of the most interest in relation to Poteat's work are, I think, Cluster 2, the illocutionary force, and Cluster 5, what I call witnessing presence, which I think is a term I got from him. If not, I made it up soon after my experience of sitting in his classrooms. To set his work in the landscape of these other investigations, I'm going to look at just two texts. One is Testimony, Illocution, and the Second Person by Richard Moran, a philosopher at Harvard, which provides a useful introduction to the second approach, the illocutionary force approach. And as his title suggests, Moran draws explicitly on the work of J.L. Austin, which gives Moran and Poteat a common ancestor. And then I want to look at Marcel's essay, inaptly titled Testimony and Existentialism, which has resonance with the work of Poteat along several axes. So first, Moran. Moran's reference in his title to the second person invokes recent discussions of what is called correlative, in the philosophical literature, correlative bipolar normativity. Discussions which have emphasized the dimension of moral and legal obligation that relates specific individuals to each other in pairs, such as promisor and promisee, or debtor and creditor. Stephen Darwall captured this under the rubric of the second person standpoint. In other words, what they're trying to get at are those transactional uses of language which simply can't be accomplished unless there is another person there. You can't make a promise unless there's someone that you're promising. You can't lend money unless you're lending money to someone who accepts the debt. So there's this whole literature out there now on the second personal. Whereas other theorists of the second personal have apparently tended to study this bipolar relational normativity in the domain of practical reason, Moran wishes to extend its applicability to the domain of speculative reason, theoretical reason giving as well. So he's not saying, well, yes, in this value realm that goes on. He wants to say, as I think Polanyi does, it goes on in where people think they're just exchanging information. It's still going on. Testimony is still at work. In their illocutionary force, he considers the speech acts of asserting that P is the case, claiming P, claiming that P is true, or telling someone what is so. He says these are all intersubjective. They have to be intrinsically understood to be intersubjective rather than observational. They are normative, involving accountability and the willing assumption of responsibility rather than neutral. They are committed rather than detached. Thus, the illocutionary act that is inseparable from any genuine assertion, claiming or telling someone that something is the case, is an act of testifying. So Moran goes on, speech acts such as claiming and telling and the intersubjective relations that such acts invoke are the primary way that truths are communicated in ordinary human verbal discourse. It is in this way, then, the act of testimony provides a way of conveying a reason for belief that is essentially different from directing someone to some evidence that P is the case. For nothing becomes evidence for P in virtue of someone's attitude toward it, or in virtue of his presenting, for something becomes evidence for P only in virtue of someone's attitude toward it, or in virtue of that person's presenting it to another person as evidence. So this whole realm of discourse that so many philosophers think just sort of lies there and takes care of itself is offered by Moran as an act of testimony that has to be understood as an act of testimony lest we lose something critical to what's going on, that it's a transaction. Now my point here is that in 2013, this is a very recent article, a Harvard philosopher felt that he was moving the conversation forward by making an argument that both Poteat and Polanyi made much earlier, but to relatively little philosophical effect. I recall with what vivid energy Poteat contended in his seminars that the testimony of the speaker is finally the best we have in the way of a guarantee of any propositional provision of information. Not perhaps what we would want, not perhaps what we have taught is desirable, but the most we can get. Although we have been habituated to think that the facts themselves, self-evident, rationally collated, and impersonally regarded and assessed, provide the guarantee, Poteat's position was we must give that up. Once we grasp that all facts require some level of interpretation, and once we accept that reality is inexhaustible, we are thrown into a sea of partial, perspectival, and fallible interpretations. So when an expert says, to the best of my knowledge, And when other similarly knowledgeable authorities concur, we recognize that assurance or testimony of experts as about the best we can get in the way of assurance. When testimony is understood in this way, a primary issue of concern is the noetic depth, the reliability of the one who testifies, the trustworthiness of our relationship with that one who offers and expects us to believe and act upon her testimony. This I take to be Polanyi's dominant use of the notion as well. So it becomes a question for us, right? Why is it now a subject of intense philosophical interest when it wasn't? Was it a question of Poteat not finding the right journals? Was it a question of his not finding the right language to interact with the community, or was he just too early? Did other things have to transpire before this could be absorbed? And then turning to Marcel, and I am going to stop in 5 minutes. Marcel's work was not the subject of any of Poteat's courses when I was at Duke, and I do not recall anyone in my cohort working on Marcel. Yet it is useful to focus here on Marcel as part of a project of beginning to explore the depth of Poteat's debt to a distinctively French tradition that French philosophers refer to as reflective philosophy. I've never found that in any American text. The French tradition of reflective philosophy, which loosely, in Marcel's own terms, is the deepening of metaphysical, meaning not physical, metaphysical knowledge by means of steps whereby experience, instead of evolving techniques, turns inward toward the realization of itself. The experience, instead of developing techniques, turns inward toward itself. A careful examination of Marcel's important essay, The Ego in its Relation to Others, discloses strong similarities to the work, or at least the teaching, of Poteat in the analysis of the meaning of person, which Marcel opposes to individual. Indexing, I think, Marcel's tendency to make the other more constitutive of the self than Poteat ever did. But they also have in common deep critical, negative assault on the educational system. It almost sounds, when Marcel is talking about his own education, it sounds a lot like Poteat talking about Duke. It's the desert in which I was expected to survive. Marcel comments acerbically on the course of study that he pursued that offered, quote, hardly anything that could touch our sensibility or fulfill our most pressing inward needs. He refers to French education as abstract and inhumane. So, but they also, I think, both work. Marcel is explicit about this. Marcel contrasts thinking, formulating, and judging with what education teaches us to do really well, and discovering, exploring, and imagining, which he thinks has been sort of totally left out of the French educational project. And I think that contrast resonates very nicely with Poteat. We find in both the same emphasis on the concrete, the particular, and the temporal. Interestingly, and it's nice, we're in the room with the piano and the scores on the board, both Marcel and Poteat were deeply interested in art and music. Marcel himself was a composer, and he wrote plays, which he thought were more important than his philosophy. And they were interested in the arts for, I think, the very same reasons. When Marcel turns his attention to the matter of testimony, he does not, in fact, invoke testimony as a guarantee for the propositional content of an utterance, but as an alternative form of truth, either alongside propositional truth or possibly replacing propositional truth. And I'm out of time, so I'm just going to stop. that was a start. And now other people can talk about